this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
So, Chair, we're here today to speak to my private member's bill C-377, an act to amend the Parliament of Canada Act by adding the following subclause. Quote, a member of the Senate or the House of Commons who applies for secret security clearance from the Government of Canada is, for the purposes of the consideration of their application, deemed to need access to the information in respect of which that application is made, unquote. So really, what does this mean? It means that for the purposes of applying for the security clearance, parliamentarians have a need to know. The most important aspect to understand is that this bill would only allow parliamentarians to apply for a secret security clearance. The government would then not be able to deny, regardless of which party is in government, a parliamentarian from applying. That is all that it will do. That's all it would do. It would allow them to apply. The bill does not guarantee a parliamentarian will pass should they apply. They still must go through the same government security vetting and clearance process. I've had a secret level security clearance for decades now. I've had a top secret security clearance for over 15 years. Having a clearance does not guarantee that one gets access to whatever classified information they want, whenever they want, or on any classified issue. One still must demonstrate the need to know to the government to get access to the classified information. This is really the second safeguard of the need to know principle on how the system protects classified information. So why is it so important to allow parliamentarians a secret security clearance? The preamble of my bill C-377 states, in the face of threats to world peace and security posed by nefarious state and non-state actors, the Government of Canada needs to make challenging decisions related to national security, which it must do in a manner that is consistent with its constitutional duty to be accountable to Parliament and that respects the Canadian rights and freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. This highlights the need to improve transparency, accountability, and education with respect to the ever-changing threats to Canada and our democratic institutions and processes. But ultimately, for Parliament to rebuild the trust in those same democratic processes and institutions. Let's look at some testimony that you have heard at this PROC committee in just the last year. You had Vincent Rigby here, who served as the National Security and Intelligence Advisor from January of 2020 to June of 2021. He stated that transparency needed to be increased by producing annual public threat assessments, responding to the inciteful reports, publishing intelligence priorities, and most importantly, sharing, quote, more intelligence with members of Parliament, unquote. From the conclusion of Top Secret Understanding the Canadian Intelligence and National Security Community that was edited by Stephanie Carvin, Thomas Juneau, and Craig Forces, it states, quote, Canadians, and indeed their political leaders, must have context to avoid swinging wildly from indifference to panic when security events occur. Likewise, transparency and national security literacy help citizens tease apart real scandals from the noise. More generally, Canadians shall need to develop a renewed understanding of the hard dilemmas that frequently arise in securing a free and democratic state, unquote. Let's look at a few real-life parliamentarian examples where access to classified information has become a political hot potato, both under this current Liberal government and under the former Conservative government. Respectively, the Winnipeg Labs, and under the previous Conservative government, the Afghan detainee file issue. How did Parliament ultimately address both those issues? They formed ad hoc committees at the last minute and created a whole lot of undue politicization of the whole process, where if Parliament had members already cleared, this would have sped up the process and helped downplay the politicization. More recently, let's look at foreign interference. We know that parliamentarians are being targeted, and this isn't new. We can go back to the 2019 annual report by the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, where they recommended that parliamentarians need to be briefed on threats that they face from foreign interference. This again has been further emphasized and highlighted in the most recent and ongoing public inquiry into foreign interference, the NCIRA review, in their report, and in the most recent NSICOP report on public interference that was just tabled in June, or sorry, it was actually tabled in May. And again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the generic, and we've heard some of this feedback from parliamentarians that have received some of the generic defensive briefs on foreign interference. It's not specified, doesn't have enough detail to actually make them understand the threats that parliamentarians are facing. So in response to these reports, the government did table Bill C-70, and kudos to Parliament for fast-tracking that bill with all party support, because there's one relevant aspect of Bill C-70 that made changes to the CSIS Act. These changes now allow CSIS to share classified information beyond just the federal government to other levels of government, i.e. the provinces and territories, municipal, First Nations, industry, and other stakeholders. However, one key caveat that still needs to be cracked: those individuals still must receive and gain a security clearance to be briefed. If they're not cleared, they cannot get access to that information unless it's an imminent threat. If it's going to save life, somebody's life, it's a grave public threat. There's all sorts of caveats that allow our national security agencies, including CSIS, to help out. Finally, I'd like to remind the committee of your own unanimous consent recommendation from earlier this year when you during the report, the question of privilege related to the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and other members. Recommendation 3, quote, that the government work with recognized parties' whips to facilitate security clearances at a secret level or higher of caucus members who are not privy councillors, particularly those who sit on committees with mandates concerning foreign affairs, national defence, and national security, who shall be taken as satisfying the requirements for a need to know, to ensure that they may be adequately briefed about important national security matters, including foreign intelligence threat activity directed towards Parliament or their party or its caucus members. So basically, this committee has already recommended and supported what my Bill C-377 is trying to achieve. I look forward to any questions from my honourable colleagues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruff. Okay, colleagues, we'll get right into our first round of questioning. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ruff. Perhaps you could help explain why this bill is necessary. You noted that you have a top secret security clearance arising from your service in the Canadian Armed Forces. Is it accurate or fair to say that as a sitting member of Parliament, unless you had a security clearance from a prior career, or are one of the handful of members appointed to NSCOP, as you serve on NSCOP, the chances of getting a secret security clearance or any security clearance are close to nil?
Yeah, I'd agree with Mr. Cooper on that. His sort of summary here is that it goes back to the principles around how we protect classified information in this country, and it is this need-to-know principle. And as I highlighted in my opening remarks, there's really two tests. First one is you need to be in a position to have access or a need to know. And that's where myself, as a previous member of the Canadian Armed Forces, I had, a right to, not a right, I was required to apply for a secret security clearance. And then once I moved into positions where I required top secret security clearance, I was then applied and successfully got that. However, you still, to get to my point, that doesn't mean you have access to stuff, but it's by virtue of your position. The government right now, or Parliament, I should say, really has the Cabinet, the Privy Councillors, Parliamentary Secretaries, and now NSCOP that have security clearances, and that's really it. There are maybe some rare exceptions where a member has successfully made the requirement to the government, but it's rare. And I'm not aware of any. And the point is the government could just deny it at any point by saying, guess what? You don't have a need to know. The purpose of this bill, it allows that need to know to occur. And again, I can just go back to the two historical examples I highlighted with the Afghan detainee files and the Winnipeg labs. The reason the government wouldn't hand stuff over to the relevant committees at that time that were studying it was the first response, you don't have a security clearance.
Thank you. And your bill amends the Parliament of Canada Act by establishing a presumption that a member of Parliament or senator have access or be granted a secret security clearance on the basis of a need to know. It is, to clarify, merely a presumption. It merely gets the member or senator's foot in the door for the first step of the process, but that's it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It just establishes that as parliamentarians we have a need to know, and I've laid out the historical examples. In particular, the one that's most relevant, I think, that we're all facing today is the foreign interference side. We need to be able to take this serious. And look, this is a pet peeve of mine going back decades, long before I was elected. Canada is terrible at, we overclassify things. We do not understand. We sort of pay lip service to national security. And the first step to rebuilding that trust in our democratic processes is getting those of us that represent the Canadian populace, i.e. elected members of parliament and senators, to have a better understanding of the threats that we face, because there are tough decisions. I'm sorry to break it for those that break the news to some that maybe aren't aware. The world is actually getting more volatile and more complicated than we've ever seen. And the first step to us addressing that is us becoming smarter here and more educated in Parliament. And my bill only does that first step. It doesn't guarantee you have access. And
another point I would ask that you elaborate on is that it is specific to a secret security clearance. That is different than, for instance, a top secret security clearance. So can you perhaps explain what a secret security clearance is relative versus a top secret security clearance, and the rationale for specifically selecting that a presumption in favor of a secret security clearance for members and senators?
Yeah, good question. I mean, anybody,
90 seconds here, Mr.
You
Ruff.
can Google the Treasury Board Secretariat rules to explain what's the difference between enhanced reliability, confidential, secret, top secret. But here's in a nutshell the easiest way to break it down. In my estimate, 95% of the intelligence that needs to be shared amongst any government department or parliamentarians is never above the secret level. The difference between secret and top secret really is top secret is how did we get that information, and the need to protect the sources, whether that's people, whether that's techniques, whether that's whatever, and that really, who cares? We need to know what the crux of the information is, and that's why secret is the appropriate level. And again, the resources required to communicate at the top secret level is very costly. I mean, I can go into length on where we lack on just classified communication systems in this country if it comes up in another question.
I'm still struggling with what the intentions of this bill really are. So when I look at it and I read the language in the bill, it says deemed to need to access to the information in respect of which the application is made. That language strikes me as particularly concerning, given the fact that if I, as a member of Parliament, want to apply for a secret security clearance, I don't have that currently, as far as I know. Actually, I may have, as a parliamentary secretary, I may actually have that. If I were, any member of Parliament were to say, I want to access a certain type of intelligence or national security related information, and that I would be deemed need to know. Am I misinterpreting that? So you're shaking your head, so please clarify for me, because that's the way I interpret that language, that it's very broad.
It is, but it isn't. At the same time, I mean, if you read the clause, it states very specifically, for the purpose of the consideration of this application, right? So, look, in an ideal, not an ideal world, but in my opinion, I'd love to see every member of Parliament and senator, upon being appointed or elected, go through the security clearance process, and if you fail it, because there's no guarantee you're going to get it, that it's publicized far and wide. Politically, I don't think that's acceptable, and so therefore that'll never happen. And look, I really struggled with, on my first cut of this, on how do I do this without weighing into questions of parliamentary privilege and the access of that information. That's why I wrote the bill as only the first step in addressing this thing, which is just, it allows you to apply, and you cannot be turned away. That's all my bill does. That's why that second clause, and I mean, I wish the language could be even more in plain speak, but when you work with the drafters sometimes it gets into, you know, I don't know, like I'm not a lawyer, so drafting some of this stuff, but that's the way it was written. But that's the intent. It only allows you to apply, and you only need to know for the purpose of getting that application. And your example, Mr. Turnbull, very good. You likely have a secret security clearance, but you're not even aware of it. And how many secret documents have you read since you've been a parliamentary secretary? Likely very few. Well, I'd argue none, because if you're not even aware that you have it, then I would argue you have yet to read it, even though you have a clearance.
Yeah. So I think you might actually be wrong on that, but that's okay. But that's all right. The point though is that need to know, in terms of me making an application or any other member of parliament, I'm using myself as the example. But if I make the application and I'm automatically deemed to need to know, if I were to then get through that screening process, then I would actually get access to that information. That's the part that I'm struggling with, because the language in the bill is not clear as to the fact that there would be another gated step in terms of who determines whether I need to know that information. And I mean, you can understand the concern that one would have if any member of parliament could make an application for a secret security clearance, and then be deemed to need to know that information for which they have applied. If they get through the process, then they get access to that information.
So, yeah, that was the whole purpose of what I highlighted, the second step of need to know. Just because you have it doesn't mean you get access. I've had top secret security clearance. I maintained that when I first retired from the military, because if I hadn't been successful in getting elected, I would have likely gone into, who knows, defense consulting, defense contracting, something where I needed. So I had my security clearance transferred for the Canadian Armed Forces over to a private company that then gets registered with Public Works, at the time now PSPC, so that I maintain it. But I sat here for the first 2.5 years of being elected. Before I got put on NCICOP, I actually stood up in the House one day and asked for classified information with national security threats that the government was saying existed. Did the government give me access to one classified document? No. I sit on NCICOP. Does that mean NCICOP gets to see and ask for any document that I want to read? Absolutely not. And I have the highest clearances. So that's the second principle. The government always has that ability to control, regardless of the department, of what information is shared with who. That's the whole processes. And then you got to get into the resource thing that I mentioned too. Unless you're on a system that actually allows you to read classified documentation, you can't read it unless somebody prints a hard copy out of it, and then you got a whole nother process. And when you go through the process, you actually learn what the requirements are to protect that information.
Got that. So would individuals so you're saying that there's another need to know, which is a second layer of need to know, which is determined by the government, which is not included in your bill. It's not referenced in your bill. So where does that sit? Does that sit in the legislation that this is amending, that you can clearly identify? Because that's my concern when I read this. It seems to throw the doors wide open. So you're saying no, which I appreciate that clarification, but I would want an assurance as to where that other need to know sits within the legislation, and to just know that there's another gate that people have to get through, because my concern would be that people would be able to access information that they're deemed to need to know, that they perhaps shouldn't have access to, or where there's no rational justification for them to have access to that information. I mean, there's lots of information I'd like to have access to. I'd like to have access to the information that's referred in the NCICOP report about the foreign interference, allegations of foreign interference in the Conservative leadership race. I would like to have access to that and be clear on that. Currently,
Mr. Turnbull, going to need you to wrap up, please.
Yeah. Currently, the Conservative leader has not got a security clearance, which I find slightly suspect, and can't understand why, as an individual in your caucus, that would be allowed to be acceptable. But I digress. And
Mr. Turnbull, I'm going to have to leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But this doesn't guarantee that all members get that clearance. Membership on committees moves consistently. We have, things come up. We need to be in our ridings. We get sick. It happens. All of that occurs. So say we're in a committee where we're dealing with those sensitive informations and everybody on the committee has that security clearance, but you're sick that day. You need someone to come in and come in. They don't have the clearance. It halts all committee business. Yes, no?
Not at all, because that's the purpose of when I first was sort of thinking this idea up was like, all right, let's mandate that the Defense Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, Public Safety Committee, all should have a secret security clearance. Well, all right, then how much is an appropriate number, and then how do you control that? No, my bill actually allows every parliamentarian. So ideally, after the next federal election, there'll be 343 members elected that will all have a secret security clearance should they choose to apply, because again, I'm not going to weigh in on your parliamentary privileges, but should they choose to apply, they'll do that. That will give all the political parties ultimately that flexibility, because technically their whole caucus, all members of parliament, all senators could have a secret security clearance should they apply and should they pass.
What if they don't pass?
If they don't pass, that's a great another question, and that's where actually when I talked to to bureaucrats about this, they actually said this is a great idea. I talked to people in PCO and the National Security. They said this is a great idea. You'll never get political acceptance of this because your political colleagues will be worried that if somebody fails to pass the application and that becomes news, that there's going to be political ramifications.
We are all equal members, though. Doesn't that unbalance that equality amongst members? Even if someone chooses not to take that on for their own choice. I mean, your own leader chose to not get security clearance. There's a choice in that. How do you balance that out and ensure that we're all equal?
So I'll clarify just the last part of it. So Mr. Poilievre is a former Privy Councillor, former minister. He has been cleared, has top secret security clearance while he was a minister, and it was actually renewed every 2 years under the previous government. The current government in 2019, according to a response I got back that was signed off by Mr. Dugald, is that they changed it in 2019, and now ministers of the current government actually, once they've been cleared, they never have to get cleared again. They're not reviewed or vetted ever again.
Fine. So he chose not to have access to specific information, but if members choose not to have access to specific information through getting or not getting a security clearance, doesn't that take the balance and the fairness and that equality out of all members supposedly being equal?
It's a great question, but right now members don't have access to anything, right? So, and the point is my bill doesn't actually tackle, it's a great discussion that we should have. My bill doesn't even go that far. My bill just allows you to apply for a security clearance. That's all it does. And then it allows Parliament and committees going forward to make those cases to the government of the day to say, we think we should get access to further information.
Sorry, but it does go that far in that if members are not allowed, if they are not granted that access, that creates that division in an open way. And you said it could even be political, it could be used against them. If we're talking about the rule of law here, where people have a decision to make on their representative, nothing should interfere in that decision, and yet that additional level of security clearance or not having it, having information, access to information that others don't have in those different ways, that undermines that, does it not?
It doesn't, because, I mean, that's just the rules we have in place, that if you get access to classified information, there's consequences, that if you don't, if you fail to protect that information under the current Treasury Board rules, and that's the point, that if you fail it, it means that the security apparatuses, law enforcement ceases, everybody that's part of that review process is telling the government, do not grant this member a security clearance because they can't be trusted. Really, that's what it comes down to. And so that's a valid concern. However, that's a privacy thing. That should never see the light of day. Like, there's lots of cases that could be made. But again, that's up to an individual's choice as a member. And that's why you can't make it mandatory. As much as some of us would love to see it mandatory and make it to do it, you can't grant somebody if they can't be trusted because that's what our professional government officials, that's their job, is to protect this stuff. They're not going to give access to information to anybody if they actually haven't, if they're not, considered secure and that they're going to properly safeguard classified information in this country.
But to some degree, doesn't the executive branch already do that between?
Just a few seconds remaining here, Mr. Ruff. And
instead of CSIS doing that, doesn't the executive branch within government sort of do that already? Like you're saying that you're moving maybe those decision-making factors away?
No, not at all, because it's not the executive
disputing?
government really that makes those decisions when somebody gets a security clearance. Look at what ended up happening with the two ad hoc committees. Each party had to put names forward. People were then passed before they were given clearance or access to any information.
Thanks very much, Ms. Matheson. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ruff, approximately how many Canadians have applied for a secret security clearance or otherwise have a secret security clearance at the present time? Do you have any statistics on
Yeah, look,
that?
I asked another OPQ that somebody might have signed off in the room in the last little while. In the last decade, there's been approximately 250,000 secret security clearances applied for across government departments. Obviously, it's not that large, but that's over a decade time frame. Know how many were denied out of those 250,000 approximately applications for secret security clearance? 23. 23 at the secret level.
So
All right.
250,000 applications in the last decade, and yet, as it presently stands, a sitting member of Parliament, putting aside being in cabinet, being a parliamentary secretary, having a clearance from a previous career, is shut out. I mean, it seems passing strange. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, having regard for the fact that parliamentarians, a core function is to hold the government to account on matters of national security, foreign policy, national defense, and so on, public safety. And how does it make sense that 250,000 Canadians have secret security clearances, but if I, as a member of Parliament, applied, I'd almost certainly be turned down?
That's why Bill C-377 has been tabled, Mr. Cooper.
And you noted in your testimony that a key recommendation of this committee's report on the question of privilege concerning MP Michael Chong and other members arising from the government's failure to inform them they and their families were being targeted by the Beijing regime provided, and I'll just read into the record the recommendation, quote, that the government work with recognized parties' whips to facilitate security clearances at secret level or higher to ensure that they be adequately briefed about important national security matters. That effectively is what your bill would enshrine, correct? As at least, I guess to be clear, the first step of that.
Yeah. In fact, this committee's already unanimously made a recommendation that goes much further than what my bill actually achieves. My bill just allows parliamentarians to apply for a secret security clearance. It doesn't garner access. You've actually, as a committee, have already unanimously passed that you feel certain committees need not only to have a clearance, need to have a higher than secret level clearance. That's but that's what you guys determined here, and that then you actually get the information and get briefed on it for certain committees. I wholly support that recommendation that the PROC committee's made. My bill doesn't actually go that far.
Second reading debate on your bill, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety said the following with respect to your bill, quote, "It does not address what information they, as in members of Parliament and senators, would be looking for, where they would access it physically, how they would maintain it, and on this ad hoc basis, what would actually come of it," end of quote. Don't those arguments from the Parliamentary Secretary entirely miss the objective of your bill?
It does. It goes to the next step, but again, my bill only addresses the right and privilege of parliamentarians to apply for a secret security clearance. It doesn't. It's valid concerns about once a committee's decided. It's no different if it was PROC here that says, you know what, we're studying, we want to, here's actually a potential study for this committee. How, maybe it's more for BOIE, is, all right, should a committee have all their members appropriately cleared, and we decide that Parliament decides going forward to the next step that we need to be doing much more studies at a more classified nature. How do you address the resources, and how do you, because then it comes down, and a point that I want to go to, when I was in the military, my last job before I went to Iraq was handling joint training for the whole Canadian Armed Forces. I put together a consequent management exercise working with the Government Ops Center and Public Safety, 47 different government departments and agencies involved in that. In dealing with an improvised nuclear device having gone off in Peggy's Cove, and then how do you deal with that? And again, not a D&D lead or a CAF lead, but we know is the force of last resort. One of the huge challenges that we identified, and this is all unclassified, is the lack of infrastructure and the lack of even government bureaucracy, people with the appropriate clearance right across this country at the other levels of government. How many people in a hospital have a secret level clearance or access to secret level information that if a terrorist threat was coming down the pipe and that you may want to be prepared to deal with the consequences of it, where does that happen? So I can go on forever about the challenges and some of the necessary infrastructure and investment that needs to be put into the ability to share classified information. But again, it's a step past my bill.
My interpretation of the bill, and you highlighted it very clearly, is in Article 13(1)A, you explain that it is for the purposes of the consideration of their application. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how a security process rolls out. So there's I don't want to call it need to know, because the need to know is referenced somewhere later on in the process, but this is more of a reason to apply. Why do you need to apply for one? Because in order to actually get your clearance, you need to have a reason to apply. So staffers who work in ministerial offices have to have someone who's authorized to put their name on the list to even apply. After the person applies, they have to go through the process. They have to pass said process. Once they get the process, and if they have secret clearance, that does not mean that we are now reading the JFK files and we have access to everything under the moon. That is not what this is. That's where the need to know in terms of compartmentalizing the information that is at your disposal. Ministers who are Privy Council members do not have access to every ministerial classified document out there. There is another process in terms of being able to access specific information. So this is not opening up Pandora's box to any member of Parliament who wants to know where our intelligence assets are or anything like that. And I think it's really important that members of Parliament understand that, because this is allowing you to apply for the clearance. Am I correct?
You just said that much more eloquently than I've been trying to make my case, and so I do appreciate that. And that's why the preamble's as long as it is, actually, because in the end, it's as you know, this bill is literally it's one sentence or two sentences long, and that's it. This is only for allowing you to apply. It doesn't take away any of those necessary protections or safeguards that are already in place, and it's just and part of my goal of bringing this forward is to be here today to have this conversation and talk about this, because we don't get to talk about it otherwise, and this is something that I think is drastically important that we as a Parliament get our heads wrapped around and take more seriously national security and intelligence. And the best way to do that is actually get educated on the process and how we protect information.
So further to that, I previously sat on the National Defence Committee, and I have in my hand a letter that was signed from the then chair of the National Defence Committee to the then Minister of National Defence, dated December 7th, 2017, at which we explained to the Minister that during the study of Canada's involvement in NATO and the study of Canada and the Ukraine crisis, that information that the committee needed in order to do that study was not available to them, that they were, quote unquote, as a result of not having access to certain critical information through briefings or documents, the committee feels they have been unable to complete their work. related to the study in an effective and comprehensive manner. The first issue appears to stem from the requirement of officials to confirm security credentials of members of Parliament before providing information to the committee. So we're doing incredible work here, work that is affecting global situations, that we unfortunately can't complete the work because we do not have access to the information. I honestly do believe that we are all honorable members. I honestly believe that given the responsibility of our own national security, I do not think members of Parliament would be using it for nefarious reasons. I do not think they'd be standing up in the House of Commons and using parliamentary privilege to, spew information, as they understand very well what that would mean. And I think this is a learning opportunity to have those hard conversations, because the face of intelligence and our national security has changed. Do you agree that it is time that we actually start having these conversations and actually move the dial forward to make sure that members of Parliament are able to do the work that they are required to do?
Absolutely. And how did the Minister of National Defence respond to the Defence Committee's ask to get or point recommendation to get more access?
So I don't believe the members of the National Defence Committee have security access.
Is there a concern that with those who have the information already and putting those levels of classification on, if they understand that all members of Parliament might have it, that they would classify things differently, thereby increasing levels of security clearance so that it just becomes out of reach additionally?
Not at all. I mean, there is no, as somebody that was in that business for 25 years, there's no thought of that. I mean, you can pull up the Treasury Board rules, and each of the departments have sort of their own guidelines on how stuff gets classified, and it's really about, it has nothing to do with who has access or who has a clearance. It's all based upon, does this information pose a security threat to Canada if it gets out?
In my limited time, another question I had, a concern was that all members of Parliament would be granted security clearance access, depending if they pass or what have you. But if they don't, would that not be seen as a breach of their privilege because the levels of being a member of Parliament would then give you access? Like, isn't it a bit of a loop in that regard?
It's as I go. Just because you have clearance doesn't mean you get access to anything. I mean, it's no different than, you could make the case, I sit on NCICOP, I get access to stuff, but is that a breach of your parliamentary privilege because certain members get access to information? No, this is no different. This is just saying you have a right to apply. That's all it does.
No, I'm saying that if you apply and you're not granted it, this bill says because I'm a member of Parliament, I get to apply. But if I'm not granted it, couldn't that be a concern of a breach of privilege?
No, because there's nothing within, the Parliament of Canada Act that says you have a right to classified information. My bill slowly allows you to apply for a security clearance. It's not breaching your privileges. And if you failed it, I think that's a valid question that we should be debating, or, that would be a concern to not only Canadians, but to Parliament, is if we have parliamentarians, whether they're MPs or senators, that fail to actually pass a security clearance.
Right, but again, isn't that a breach of my privilege? Like if I fail? So you're saying that we have every right to question that. So wouldn't that go through the Speaker as a breach of privilege?
If a member of Parliament or a parliamentary senator wants to bring forth the fact publicly that they failed to pass a security clearance, good on them. I don't think it would reflect well on the government that appointed the senator, or very well on that member's ability to get reelected with their populace if they're trying to make the case to their riding. Please reelect me. I can't even get a security clearance in this country.
Ms. Matheson, that's all the time we have. We have. Do you want 20 seconds to clarify if you have a question there?
Could we get her to clarify, please?
That we're getting to the crux of that, though, like it undermines all of that democratic rule of law, breach of privilege, if you're denied.
It's a valid question that this committee can feel free to address and try to tackle as the next step. But again, my bill doesn't guarantee anything. It just allows you the right to apply. It doesn't, and I would actually caution against Parliament, deciding and ruling on the fact that all members of Parliament or parliamentarians automatically get access to a secret level security clearance. I would not support that. Personally, I would vote against that if that came forward. It's a personal choice whether you want to apply or not. And again, we have a process in place. And if you think we need to change our Treasury Board rules around what is required to pass a security clearance, that's fair game. But as I said, my bill doesn't address that. It doesn't seek to address that. It just allows you the opportunity to apply and not be denied that opportunity to actually apply for a secret level security clearance.
Okay, thanks very much for the
Appreciate it.
clarification, both Smith Maston and Mr. Ruff. Mr. Ruff, thank you very much. That was an interesting discussion, and your testimony today was valuable, so thank you very much.